冒険者になりたいんですけど。
Every so often there's a kind of chain reaction of discovery on the internet, and it seems like the anime service Crunchyroll, who you shouldn't be giving money to, look into their practices and so on, but still, it seems that they've released an anime called Goblin Slayer. And so everyone is suddenly talking about this and what happens in it and how cool it is and all this. So obviously a lot of people in the gaming community are suddenly thinking about, oh, wow, how do I bring some of that stuff into my game? And yeah, it's a little bit odd, because in this atmosphere of hyper-political correctness and so on, here is an unremittingly old school in temperament, uncompromising and very Japanese cartoon that doesn't have reconstructed cutesy goblins who play around with devices and are kind of cartoonish and nice and maybe even player characters. It's completely unreconstructed, and maybe that's part of the appeal. I don't know. It's just odd in the atmosphere of discussion that we find to see something like this becoming so popular, and a lot of people want to bring some of these elements into their games. I'm not sure that will work exactly, because the premise of the anime, the premise of the manga, works on this juxtaposition of your expectations of shiny D&D style light heroic fantasy running headlong into Vietnam in a dungeon.
なあ、一緒に冒険に来てくれないか？君、神官だろ？俺のパーティー、聖職者がいなくって。だけど急ぎの依頼で、せめてもう一人欲しいんだ。
Now, if you really wanted to recreate the feel and the impact, at least of that first episode or issue of Goblin Slayer, you would have to do a bait and switch on your players. You would have to create what appears to be a light, frothy, standard fantasy game with all the usual tropes and things. I mean, that's basically what the anime does, what the manga does. You know, you turn up at the Adventurers Guild, you register, you fill out your character sheet, essentially, and then you meet this bunch of other bright-eyed, bushy-tailed would-be adventurers who are ready to go off questing. There's even a little joke about going and killing rats and clearing out the sewers. So, yeah, that kind of thing as being the low-level adventurer thing to do. And then you plunge them into this absolute horror show of goblins. It's difficult to do that in a tabletop game. For a one-shot or a convention game or something, that can be effective, the bait and switch. Though, given the amount of warnings and so on you have to give out about adventures, you'd kind of tip your hand on the sign-up sheet at a convention, unless you wanted to get into trouble, given the anti-harassment policies and things that are now in. But there's always a big risk in doing that kind of bait and switch, because players come into a game with a particular expectation, they build their characters with a particular idea, and then when you pull the rug out from under them, it doesn't always go well. Yeah, you have to be experienced, you have to know your group, you have to understand the kind of nuance, the back and forth, if you want to do this successfully. And obviously with Goblin Slayer on everyone's mind at the moment, now is not the time to do it anyway. But you run the risk of having people put a lot of effort and love into creating a character for a particular kind of game, and then switching it on them and upsetting them and even angering them, and making it into a situation where they're not going to have any fun. So you've got to be really careful about that. But this isn't the only thing, this bait and switch, that you can take from Goblin Slayer.
心配性だな。ゴブリンなんて体も知性も子供並みだし、怪物の中でも最弱だよ。俺は村に来たのを追っ払ったことあるぜ。
自慢にもならないでしょ。
I guess the main lesson to take from this is that low-level creatures don't just have to be sword fodder. You know, kobolds, troglodytes,
Pictures, sprites, elfin folk. all manner of goblinry.
These things, whatever they are, they're monsters. They're supposed to be monsters. They're supposed to be scary. They're supposed to do terrible, horrible things, and they have at least human scale-ish intelligence. You know, they can lay ambushes, they can set traps, they can do all kinds of things that would turn the tables on the adventurers. They don't just have to be easy, low-level, low XP monsters that you just go around slaughtering for a couple of levels. They can be a genuine threat in their own right. But how do you go about doing that? One way is to be ruthless in the way that you play when you're the games master. I mean, no games master should really be out to kill the players, regardless of the game, even if you're playing something on the grittier end of the spectrum. But unless you have a game system that kind of supports that, that's not going to help you out very much. So unless you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or Lamentations of the Flame Princess or something else on the darker, grittier end of fantasy, then the system isn't necessarily going to support what you're trying to do. But you can still be ruthless regardless of the game. You can give the adventurers, you can give the players no quarter, but you should probably forewarn them a little, unless you're doing this bait and switch, that you really need them to understand that this is a Dark Souls situation, that you're not going to pull punches, that you're going to kill players if the opportunity arises. And even if you as the games master are not out to slaughter them, then the goblins and whatever other monsters you might have certainly are. You know, you're invading their home. Think about what they have to hand that they can use against the adventurers. In the anime, in the manga, the goblins smear their weapons with a mixture of their own excrement and urine, which is disgusting, but I did reference that dungeons were like a sort of underground Vietnam in a lot of ways, and there were tunnels in Vietnam. And this is what they smeared their punji stakes with, because even if you got a minor wound, it was much more likely to get infected, force an evac, and so slow people down, make people ill, make people wary and afraid all the time. So you can do that, improvised poisons, even if they're low level. You know, the creature might get lucky. Think about it. You're a goblin. You're the size of a human child. You know, half the height of your standard issue adventurer. Why would you live in a nice, spacious cave system where, you know, adventurers can march down 2 or 3 abreast? It just doesn't make any sense, does it? Why not make a narrow, small burrow that you can move around in freely, standing up without any problem, but which they're going to have a harder time moving through, maybe forcing them to crawl and so on, not enough space to turn around. Then maybe you can hide behind an earthen wall and burst out when they've gone past you, leaving you free to stab them up the arse as many times as you like. So terrain is something to think about. And as we saw there, mob tactics can often be very useful. Some creatures in some games have bonuses that stack when there's more and more of them attacking a single person, so gang up and maybe go for the weakest target first. Look, it's a Japanese anime, and when a woman gets captured by a monster in a Japanese anime, I think we all know what is on the cards there. But this does bring up some things that have been vectors of attack against the orcs as inherently evil idea, that this is disempowering and cartoonish and so on. But being captured is a way you can forestall just outright total party killing people. You know, if they get knocked out, you know, put to mortally wounded, whatever it might be in whatever system, they can then get captured and then have a chance to escape later on. So that's a way of kind of forestalling removing all character agency by killing them off. But you still want capture to be something horrible, something to want to avoid, and it also still needs to make sense within the context of the game and the ecosystem of the dungeon and the world outside, unless you're just not bothering with any of that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it does help suspend disbelief if there are reasons for doing things. So when they're captured, what is it for? Is it for food, entertainment, torture, sexual entertainment? You know, why are they doing it? You know, if they're going after livestock and crops, you know, that makes sense. Goblins gotta eat. You know, goblin ain't easy. But why are they kidnapping people if they are kidnapping people? Why would they capture and hold adventurers? Sacrifices to their gods? Something. It's good to have an idea of how you can go to that fallback position, why they want to do it, and how adventurers might perhaps escape or be subjected to horrors or rescued by another adventuring party or something. It's just good to have that fallback, but it has to make sense. Of course, the counterpoint to all this is that adventurer tactics also have to pay off. If you're encouraging your players to be careful and wary and scared of even something as low level as goblins, then you need to pay off their tactics. This isn't something that's particularly explored in a lot of games. It's one thing I really liked about Dragon Warriors, which I did the live stream of a few days ago, is that game talked about tactics, about how, you know, if you stand in a doorway, you can restrict the number of enemies that can attack you, or have your back to the wall, or, you know, back to back in a corridor, things like that. You know, it tackled dungeon tactics, how to control the space, how to respond to what's around. So if the players properly prepare, if their characters take the proper precautions, you know, make a plan, set traps, try to do things like use light to blind their enemies and attack from behind it, things like that, you need to be able to reward that. You know, and that way, through being cautious, through being careful, you know, the players are encouraged to feel not helpless, but rather they need to think tactically. Not in a pieces on the board kind of way, but just think tactically in a kind of situational awareness, combat awareness, preparedness and planning kind of way. And that should help them survive. Though apparently the other thing that helps you survive is having a heavy metal soundtrack.
殺すんですか？
当たり前だ。奴らは恨みを一生忘れん。それに巣穴の生き残りは学習し、知恵をつける。生かしておく理由など。
Is it okay to kill baby orcs, or goblins in this case? This is kind of like the trolley problem for adventure games. It's something that keeps coming up over and over again as this moral quandary, and in Goblin Slayer you can see the kind of hardened, embittered, nasty, murderous adventurer contrasting with the new priestess and her perhaps naive approach to this. It really depends on the metaphysics of the game world that you're involved in. Is there such a thing as objective good and evil as there is in standard D&D? Are certain races, or species is a better term, you know, are they predisposed, or are they always evil? You know, are they essentially demons made flesh, like the orcs in Tolkien's world are a deliberate, twisted mockery born into evil, you know, from the powers of dark gods and evil sorcerers? You need to understand that to really understand whether it's morally and ethically okay to slaughter goblins at birth. Are they innately, inherently evil? I mean, a lot of this comes from Judeo-Christian theology and its effect on Western literature, and therefore into fantasy. And it's interesting because many of these myths and legends and so on are pre-Christian and then are re-examined through a Christian lens. It's like the idea of the devil with horns probably comes from Synonus, or however you choose to pronounce it. People have different ways. Goblins and fairy folk and so on were folklore long before Christians turned up, and then ideas from Christianity reconfigured those through this lens to think of them as evil. And that's a religion and a metaphysic that holds that you're all tainted by evil unless you seek forgiveness. So it really does depend, but it is something that should come up. A goblin tribe that has a home in a mountain or a cave system or whatever, they're gonna have families. Where do more goblins come from? Are there female goblins, or do they foist themselves on these captured girls to raise more goblins? Again, that depends on the way your world works and so forth. But there should be non-combatants. But in a desperate hardscrabble life such as there is in dungeons, that the women and children might be just as vicious as the warriors in their own way, but they should be there. That's part of the whole suspension of disbelief and understanding dungeon ecology and how it at least fits plausibly into the world around it, and that will help you immerse people into it. Okay, let's recap. First of all, don't bait and switch your players unless you're confident that you know how they'll react, or do it as a one-off game where you switch and twist things abruptly and suddenly on them, but it's only a one-off game, so it doesn't really matter too much, so be careful there. 2, choose a system or a rules interpretation or a rule set that will support this kind of game. So Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a good choice, at least 1st edition, 2nd edition, and possibly 4th edition. Haven't had a look at it yet, but that's a good choice. Lamentations of the Flame Princess is a good choice. I once ran a fantasy game using a set of horror rules that I'd created, and that worked very, very well indeed. So that's another possibility. If you're willing to do conversions, find a gritty system and convert it over to fantasy. So that's another way to do it. Consider what the low-level baddies, the goblins or whatever else it might be, have at their disposal. So the terrain, poison, in their hoard of treasure or magic items, is there something that one of them can equip and use? Why would you leave it on a pile if it's powerful? What tactics can they use to boost things up? Do they have any particular traits and things that you can use to stack to give them advantage and to disadvantage the players? That includes terrain, small tunnels, ambushes, things like that. Be cunning in the same way that the players can be cunning. Fourthly, speaking of that, allow player tactics and preparedness to make a difference. So reward good tactics and so forth. And I guess lastly is just consider what they're doing within the broader context of the game if you want to suspend disbelief, and that's pretty important, more so in grittier games than it is in more high fantasy games. I mean, you lose that bait and switch ambush idea, but it's still there. Suspension of disbelief is really important. Immersion is really important in RPGs. That's the goal, to think and react as your character. And in a grittier world, that needs to be tactically and viciously and unrelenting, whether it's the adventurers or the monsters. Put all that together and you can make even low-level encounters pretty fucking deadly. Zang.
Time to light it up, raise it to the sky and watch it burn, 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 burn.
I can make it happen. I can get you anything you want. You just have to talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. I am your priest. I'm your shrink. I'm your main connection to the switchboard of souls. I'm the magic man. The Santa Claus of the subconscious. You say it. You even think it. You gotta have it.